The early 90s was something of a renaissance period for arcade gaming, with rapidly improving graphics and sound, new and interesting gameplay styles being experimented with, and of course the dominance of fighting games. In 1994, any arcade you walked into would be filled with them, including the likes of Mortal Kombat, Fatal Fury, and Samurai Showdown, but there's no doubt that the absolute king of the mountain was Capcom's Street Fighter II series, which pretty much single-handedly revolutionized competitive fighting games. But 1994 also brought with it the introduction of the CPS-2, Capcom's brand new arcade hardware that boasted superior graphics and sound, more memory, and many more possibilities for their games. The very first game released on the CPS-2 was, of course, Super Street Fighter II Turbo, one of the greatest 2D fighting games ever produced, as a way to show off what kind of improvements had been made to the classic engine. But waiting in the wings was something else that had been brewing at Capcom for over a year. A game that would be the first wholly original property on the platform to show what it could really do. And it was something monstrous.
連続技がすごい。貯めるとすごい。このバトル半端じゃない。ヴァンパイアハンターセガサターンに新登場。
In July of 1994, Capcom unleashed upon the world Vampire the Night Warriors, also known as Darkstalkers, and what a wild departure from Street Fighter it was. It still maintained the 6-button setup and many of the input commands of Capcom's flagship fighter, but in every other way was something completely different. Instead of featuring your run-of-the-mill martial artists like pretty much every other fighting game at the time, it instead featured the classic Universal movie monsters such as Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Gilmore, and the Mummy, redesigned in a more contemporary style and given all new names and backstories, complete with movesets that reflect their array of powers and abilities in keeping with their established lore. And all of these characters are brought together to do battle with a powerful alien hell-bent on dominating the Earth and adding it to his collection of planets. Darkstalkers' fighting system is more or less the same as Street Fighter II, but introduced some cool new features to the gameplay, such as air blocking, crouch walking, and being able to string together light, medium, and heavy attacks into chain combos. It's also the second Capcom fighter to introduce a super combo meter, but this too is different from the one in Street Fighter. For instance, once it's full, it immediately starts depleting, leaving you with a limited window of time to execute an attack. And in addition to allowing for super combos, you can also pull off a super-powered version of one of your regular special attacks, which is a feature that Capcom would later implement in some of their other fighters, most notably Street Fighter III. A major benefit of having such an unusual cast of characters is that they're not limited in the same way that strictly human characters are, which allows for some really cool attacks where they morph their bodies, change their size and shape, and utilize some cool reality-bending powers. And though the gameplay is really fun, it's very intuitive, but also features a lot of depth, it's the characters themselves that really make Darkstalkers such a memorable game. After all, it wasn't every day that you got to see a heavy metal zombie going toe-to-toe with a kung fu werewolf. And initially, the intention was for Dimitri, the resident vampire of the game, to be the primary protagonist of the series, but for obvious reasons, Morrigan became the instant fan favorite, and so the plot would focus more on her in the future games. And speaking of, the plot and character backstories went a long way to making this a much more interesting game beyond just the flashy surface level. And apparently, a lot of the lore of Darkstalkers, such as the demon world and character endings, resulted from a lot of input from Capcom's North American employees, going back and forth with their office in Japan. And along with Mortal Kombat, this is one of the first fighting games I can remember that actually had a plot and characters that really had me engaged. and it was oddly refreshing to see a game that didn't give every character a happy ending after completing the game. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the absolutely amazing art direction in this game, as it's not just the characters that look really cool. All of the stages made to fit each of them are a great bit of eye candy as well. Whether that be a spooky old graveyard, Frankenstein's laboratory still occupied by the corpse of the Mad Doctor himself, or the interior of Anacharus's ancient Egyptian tomb, every inch of this game is just oozing with personality and cool little details. And if you've been watching this channel for a while, you know I'm a fan of things that ooze. And on top of that, the soundtrack in Darkstalkers, which was composed by members of Alpha Lyla, Capcom's in-house band that composed pretty much all of their best music from the 90s, is phenomenal, and just like the stage designs, each track is tailored to match the personality and vibe given off by their respective characters, sometimes being energetic and fun, and sometimes being more somber and creepy. But every piece of music here is a joy to listen to, and overall, for 1994, this was a damn near perfect fighting game. Darkstalkers performed pretty well in arcades throughout 1994 and 1995, so there would of course have to be a console version. And with the 32-bit machines now making their debuts, Capcom decided to go with the Sony PlayStation for the home port, but handed the development over to Psygnosis, presumably because they were already in the process of developing some games for the new hardware and knew it pretty well. But oddly enough, the development was plagued with setbacks, and the PS1 version of Darkstalkers wasn't released until its sequel, Vampire Hunter, was already available for the Sega Saturn. Anyway, the PS1 version was solid, looking and playing more or less like the arcade version, though obviously with loading screens scattered throughout, and it featured a brand new intro sequence complete with the song Trouble Man by Andrew Gold, which is also the song that plays over the credits of the Darkstalkers anime. And speaking of, that's a nice little segue into all of the Darkstalkers related media and merch that followed the release of the original game and its sequels, Vampire Hunter and Vampire Savior, aka Darkstalkers 3, including action figures by Toy Biz, a surprising amount of manga published over the years, and the thing I'm most familiar with, the Darkstalkers 4-part OVA from 1997, called Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge. It more or less tells the story of the second game, with Pyron threatening the Earth while conflicts rage on between humanity and the Darkstalkers themselves, seen as evil, demonic beings that only exist to do harm to humanity. And with guys like Dimitri and Lord Raptor hanging around, it's pretty easy to see why. Anyway, this was a pretty cool anime that told the story of the video game very well and gave some additional backstory on our favorite monstrous bunch of fighting game characters. And the animation was pretty damn good. It was produced by the studio Madhouse, who have a lot of great anime under their belt, including personal favorites of mine like Yu Yu Hakusho, Pet Shop of Horrors, and Trigun. On the other hand, though, there was another animated series that we don't really like to talk about.
My master, I shall show you mastery. I was told that you were powerful, but you are merely adequate.
In 1995, the Earth was blighted by the coming of Darkstalkers, the animated series, an absolute joke of a show and bastardization of everything in the source material. It's from the same studio that brought us stuff like Stone Protectors, Skeleton Warriors, and of course the Street Fighter animated series, and it does basically the same thing that show did, and turns Darkstalkers into a basic good guys versus bad guys affair in the same vein as G.I. Joe and about a million other cartoons from the 90s. And does it suck? You better believe it does. It sucks like no vampire could ever even dream of.
I don't belong here.
The animation is terrible and cheap looking, the character designs are for the most part an absolute abomination, and the plot for each episode is boiled down to the most basic throwaway bullshit you've ever seen. I get that it was made for kids, but I was a kid when this show aired, 8 years old in fact, and even I knew that this was an insult. Darkstalkers deserved much better. No need to end on a down note though, because no matter what, the original Darkstalkers was, is, and always will be an awesome fighting game. It was improved upon in a number of ways in its sequels, which added new gameplay mechanics and a host of awesome new characters. But there can be no denying that in 1994, Darkstalkers was something very special and really showed what the CPS2 could do. And to this day, I still go back to this game on a fairly regular basis. It's been re-released numerous times over the years, including very recently as part of the Capcom Fighting Collection. So if you've never played it before, or if it's been a while, dig up Darkstalkers and breathe some life back into it, because it's bloody good fun, and it's awesome.
Awesome! Ready, fight!